Alone in a remote cabin, deep in Alaska's frozen wilderness, Ethan Carter faced a decision that could cost him everything. A storm was raging and a mother bear with 2 cubs was dying on his porch. Against all odds, Ethan opened the door to a story you'll never forget. Ethan Carter pulled his parka tighter around him as he leaned against the wooden frame of his cabin porch, gazing out into the snow-covered wilderness. The thermometer nailed to the cabin wall read -40 degrees Fahrenheit, but Ethan didn't need to see it to feel the bone-chilling cold. After 6 years living in the remote Alaskan wilderness, he had become accustomed to the icy grip of winter. But tonight's conditions felt different. The storm approaching wasn't like the others he'd weathered before. The air was sharper, the wind carried an unsettling howl, and a gnawing sense of foreboding settled deep in his chest. His cabin stood alone in this vast, untamed expanse, surrounded by towering evergreens draped in heavy snow. Miles away from the nearest town, his wooden shelter had become both his fortress and his solitude. The logs of the cabin bore the scars of countless storms, standing resilient against nature's wrath. But Ethan knew that this storm might push even his carefully built sanctuary to its limits. He stepped back inside, closing the door quickly to keep the icy air from seeping into the warmth of the cabin. The crackling fireplace offered a comforting glow, its heat the only defense against the relentless cold that crept through every crevice. As the flames danced, Ethan reached for his weather radio, his lifeline to the outside world. He turned the knob, adjusting the static until the urgent voice of the weather reporter broke through. A severe Arctic storm is sweeping through the region, with temperatures expected to plummet further overnight. Winds exceeding 50 miles per hour will create whiteout conditions, making travel nearly impossible. Residents are advised to stay indoors and prepare for prolonged isolation. Ethan clicked the radio off, his jaw tightening. This wasn't just another winter storm. This was the kind of weather that tested survival skills to their breaking point. He moved swiftly through his cabin, checking his supplies. The shelves were stocked with canned goods, dried meats, and emergency rations. His generator was fueled, the backup heating system was operational, and several jugs of water were filled and ready. Every move was calculated and precise, lessons learned from years of self-reliance. Ethan's eyes wandered to the photographs hanging on the cabin walls, relics from his previous life as a wildlife guide and photographer. Images of wolves prowling through forests, moose standing sentinel by frozen lakes, and bears lumbering through streams reminded him why he had chosen this life. He had traded the chaos of the city for the peace and challenges of the wilderness, and he had no regrets. Still, those pictures felt like distant echoes of a time when life was simpler. As the day wore on, the storm began its assault. Snow fell in thick, blinding sheets, quickly burying everything in its path. The wind screamed through the gaps in the trees, its ferocity rattling the cabin windows. Ethan threw another log onto the fire and stirred a pot of soup on the wood stove, the simple meal offering some comfort as night began to fall. Despite the howling wind and the storm's growing intensity, he felt secure in his preparations. His cabin was strong, his supplies abundant, and his experience in the wilderness had taught him to endure. But as the hours passed and the storm deepened, Ethan couldn't shake the unease gnawing at him. He had always prided himself on reading the signs of nature, the subtle cues that hinted at what was to come. And tonight, something felt off. The storm was too quiet in its violence, too calculated in its ferocity. It was as if the wilderness itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the stillness. The thought unsettled him, but he pushed it aside. He double-checked his satellite phone, ensuring it was fully charged, and set it next to his emergency radio. He adjusted the blankets on his bed and settled into his chair by the fire, determined to get some rest. Yet sleep wouldn't come easily. The storm's eerie howl seemed to grow louder with each passing hour, a haunting symphony that refused to be ignored. At midnight, Ethan jolted awake in his chair, his heart racing. At first he thought it was just the storm playing tricks on his mind, but then he heard it again, a deep guttural sound that cut through the howling wind. It was faint, but unmistakable. A sound that didn't belong to the storm. A sound that sent a shiver down his spine. He grabbed his flashlight and moved cautiously to the frost-covered window. Peering through the glass, he scanned the snow-covered landscape illuminated by the faint glow of the moon. At first, he saw nothing but the swirling chaos of the storm. But then movement caught his eye, dark shapes emerging from the whiteout. Then he saw it. 3 shapes, dark and lumbering, moved slowly through the whiteout. Ethan squinted, pressing his face closer to the cold glass. A larger figure trudged forward with 2 smaller ones in tow. It took a moment for him to fully process what he was seeing. A mother bear and her 2 cubs, barely visible through the veil of snow. They were moving toward his cabin, their progress agonizingly slow, as if every step cost them precious energy. Ethan's stomach dropped. Bears were meant to be deep in hibernation at this time of year. For them to be out in the open during such extreme conditions meant something had gone horribly wrong. The mother bear's massive frame should have radiated strength, but even from this distance, Ethan could see the exhaustion in her movements. Her legs wobbled as she trudged through the snow, and her head hung low. The cubs huddled close to her, their tiny bodies shivering uncontrollably. Instinct told Ethan to step back, to lock the doors and let nature take its course. Every survival guide he had ever read warned against interacting with bears, especially a mother with cubs. It was a surefire recipe for disaster. Yet as he watched the bears draw nearer, he couldn't ignore the pit of dread growing in his stomach. They weren't just wandering, they were seeking something. Shelter, safety, anything that might give them a chance to survive. The mother bear reached the edge of his porch and sank into the snow, her massive body heaving with labored breaths. She looked utterly defeated, her strength nearly gone. The cubs pressed against her sides, their movements sluggish and uncoordinated. Ethan could see frost forming on their fur, a deadly sign that their small bodies were losing the battle against the cold. Ethan stepped back from the window, his mind racing. What was he supposed to do? He thought of his insulated storage room, attached to the side of his cabin. It was meant for gear and supplies, but it was separate from his living space, warm enough to keep his equipment safe. Could it provide temporary refuge for the bears? His gaze returned to the window. The mother bear's eyes were half closed, and the cubs had stopped moving. The sight struck him harder than he expected. In his years as a wilderness guide and photographer, Ethan had seen the raw beauty and brutality of nature. He had watched wolves hunt, seen eagles swoop down to claim their prey, and witnessed the cycle of life and death unfold in countless ways. But this was different. These bears weren't just animals. They were a family, struggling to survive against impossible odds. Ethan's hands trembled as he considered his options. Everything he knew about wilderness survival screamed at him to stay inside. Opening the door to a desperate mother bear could end in disaster. But as he stared at the family huddled against his porch, their bodies slowly being buried in the mounting snow, he realized he couldn't just watch them die. He grabbed his flashlight and bundled himself in his thickest winter gear. If he was going to do this, he needed to act quickly and carefully. Before stepping outside, he secured the latch to the storage room door, ensuring it would remain open. Then, he checked the blankets and supplies he had prepared. His heart pounded in his chest as he placed his hand on the door handle, hesitating for a moment. "Just don't spook her," he muttered to himself, taking a deep breath. He opened the door. The wind hit him like a wall, freezing and relentless. Snow swirled around him, and his flashlight beam struggled to cut through the storm. He could barely make out the bears huddled in the snow just a few feet away. The mother bear's head lifted weakly, her ears twitching as she noticed him. Her eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, Ethan froze. There was no aggression in her gaze, only exhaustion and desperation. She was too weak to react, her maternal instincts warring with her depleted strength. Ethan crouched low, trying to make himself appear non-threatening, and began to speak in a low, calm voice. "It's okay," he said softly, knowing she couldn't understand his words but hoping his tone would convey his intent. "I'm here to help." Slowly he tossed a thick blanket toward the cubs, the fabric landing just short of them. The mother bear flinched but didn't move. Encouraged, Ethan spread another blanket closer to the storage room door, creating a path of warmth. The cubs were barely visible under the snow now, their small forms eerily still. "Come on," Ethan murmured, stepping back toward the storage room door. The warm air from inside spilled out, creating a faint mist in the freezing night. He hoped the mother bear would sense the heat and understand. She didn't move at first, her massive body trembling with exhaustion. Then, with painstaking effort, she began to nudge one of the cubs with her nose. It didn't respond. A low, mournful sound escaped her, a sound that cut through the howling wind and straight into Ethan's heart. "Please," Ethan whispered, stepping back further toward the open door. "You can make it." The mother bear struggled to her feet, her legs wobbling under her weight. With agonizing slowness, she gripped the blanket in her teeth and began to drag her cubs toward the warmth. Ethan held his breath, every muscle in his body tense as he watched her inch closer to the storage room. Finally, she crossed the threshold, collapsing inside with her cubs nestled beside her. Ethan closed the door gently, locking out the storm. Through the small window, he could see the mother bear curling protectively around her cubs, her breaths ragged but steady. Her eyes met his one more time, and in that moment, Ethan saw not a dangerous predator, but a mother who had fought with everything she had to save her family. Ethan Carter sat by his cabin window, staring into the swirling chaos of the storm outside. His fingers tapped nervously against the wood of the windowsill. The bears had made it into the storage room, but their ordeal was far from over. The mother bear was curled around her cubs, offering them warmth and protection, but Ethan could see the toll the cold had taken on her. Her breathing was shallow and her movement slow. The cubs, though partially blanketed, remained worryingly still. Ethan knew what he had done was already against every survival rule he had ever learned. Bringing wild animals, especially a bear and her cubs, so close to his living quarters was a gamble that could easily turn deadly. Yet he also knew that without his intervention, the family wouldn't have survived the storm. The fire in his cabin's hearth crackled, filling the room with warmth. But Ethan couldn't shake the cold knot of anxiety in his chest. He paced back and forth, replaying the events of the night in his mind. The way the mother bear had looked at him, desperate but trusting, kept coming back to him. She hadn't seen him as a threat, and for that Ethan was grateful. Still, the situation remained precarious. The storm outside howled with fury, rattling the windows and shaking the cabin walls. Ethan knew they were in for a long night, and he couldn't shake the sense that he needed to do more. He grabbed his flashlight and directed its beam through the small window of the storage room. The mother bear's eyes reflected the light for a moment, but she didn't move. Her cubs remained huddled against her, their tiny bodies almost hidden by her massive frame. Ethan's heart sank. The cubs weren't moving as much as they should be. He'd spent enough time photographing wildlife to recognize the signs of hypothermia. Their small bodies, already ill-equipped to handle such extreme cold, were clearly struggling. The mother bear was doing her best, but even she was losing the fight. Ethan ran his hands through his hair, his mind racing. What more could he do? He couldn't risk entering the storage room. Getting too close could trigger the mother bear's protective instincts, and in such close quarters, he wouldn't stand a chance. But leaving them alone to their fate wasn't an option either. He thought of the emergency supplies stored in his cabin: blankets, a portable heater, and high-calorie food. If he could get these items into the storage room without alarming the bears, it might make the difference between life and death. But how? He couldn't just walk in and drop the supplies at their feet. Ethan grabbed a sturdy plastic bin and began filling it with what he thought might help: thick wool blankets, a small battery-powered heater, and some dried fish, anything that could provide warmth and sustenance. He tied a long rope to the bin, creating a makeshift delivery system. His plan was simple: slide the bin into the storage room through the cracked door and quickly retreat before the mother bear felt threatened. The execution, however, was far from easy. Bundling himself in his thickest coat and gloves, Ethan stepped out into the storm, the freezing wind cutting through his layers like knives. Snow swirled around him, obscuring his vision and making every step toward the storage room feel like a battle. When he reached the outer door, he paused, his breath visible in the frigid air. He opened the door slowly, peering inside. The mother bear stirred slightly but didn't rise. Her massive frame seemed even larger in the confined space, her fur glistening with melted snow. Ethan could see the cubs tucked against her belly, their tiny forms almost motionless. Ethan crouched low, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. "It's okay," he murmured under his breath, his voice calm and steady. "I'm just here to help." With careful precision, he slid the bin inside, letting it come to a stop a few feet from the mother bear. She sniffed the air, her nostrils flaring as she detected the food. Her eyes flickered between the bin and Ethan, a wary intelligence shining through the exhaustion. Ethan slowly backed away, giving her space. He watched as she extended a massive paw toward the bin, pulling it closer with surprising gentleness. She nudged it with her nose, inspecting its contents. The blanket seemed to catch her attention first. With great care, she pulled one out and draped it over her cubs. The sight was so unexpectedly tender that Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. The mother bear's movements were slow and deliberate, each action measured to conserve her dwindling energy. She sniffed the fish next, taking a cautious bite before nudging the rest toward her cubs. One of the cubs stirred, its small head lifting weakly to accept the offering. It was a small but vital sign of life, and Ethan felt a flicker of hope. Retreating back into his cabin, Ethan watched the scene unfold through the window. The mother bear alternated between eating and tending to her cubs, her instincts as a provider never wavering despite her obvious exhaustion. The blankets added a layer of insulation, trapping what little warmth they could generate. The portable heater, though small, created a bubble of heat that slowly began to thaw the frozen family. As the hours dragged on, Ethan kept vigil from the safety of his cabin. He tended his own fire, occasionally stepping outside to check on the bears and replenish their supplies. Each time, the mother bear acknowledged his presence with a wary but calm gaze. It was as if she understood his intentions, or perhaps she was simply too desperate to care. The storm showed no signs of letting up, but inside the storage room, the battle for survival was being waged, and slowly, it seemed, being won. The cubs began to stir more frequently, their small bodies curling into tighter balls of fur as warmth returned to them. The mother bear, though still weak, seemed more alert, her eyes following Ethan's movements with an intensity that felt almost human. By the time dawn broke, casting a pale light over the snow-covered landscape, Ethan felt a cautious optimism. The bears had made it through the worst of the night, and though the storm still howled outside, they were alive. Ethan sat by his window sipping a cup of coffee, his eyes never leaving the storage room. The mother bear and her cubs had a long way to go, but for the first time since he had seen them struggling in the snow, he believed they had a chance. The morning light struggled to break through the storm clouds, casting a dim glow over Ethan Carter's cabin. Inside, Ethan prepared for the next critical phase of his plan. The bears had survived the night, but the storm wasn't letting up, and their recovery was far from guaranteed. The mother bear had shown remarkable resilience, but exhaustion and hypothermia were still taking their toll. Her cubs, though stirring more frequently, were far from out of danger. Ethan paced his cabin, going over his plan for the day. The makeshift supply bin he had delivered last night had helped, but it wasn't enough. The bears needed more warmth and sustenance to sustain their fragile recovery, especially as the storm continued to batter the wilderness. Ethan knew he had to act fast. The window for saving them was narrowing with every passing hour. He opened the cabin door and stepped out into the freezing wind. Snowflakes stung his face and the icy air bit at his exposed skin. Even in his thickest winter gear, the cold seeped in, reminding him of how dire the bear's situation truly was. He tightened his scarf and trudged toward the storage room, the snow crunching under his boots. When he reached the door, Ethan peered through the small window. The mother bear was curled protectively around her cubs, her massive body acting as a shield against the cold. The portable heater he had placed inside was working, but it could only do so much in such extreme conditions. The cubs were still blanketed, their tiny forms huddled together, but their movements were sluggish. Ethan's heart sank as he noticed the mother bear struggling to lift her head. Her breathing was shallow, her strength clearly fading. He couldn't wait any longer. Ethan opened the storage room door just enough to let himself inside, the warmth escaping in a brief puff of fog. He moved slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. The mother bear's eyes opened, her gaze locking onto him. Her head tilted slightly, as if assessing his intentions. Despite her weakened state, her protective instincts were evident in her watchful posture. "It's okay," Ethan murmured, his voice low and calm. "I'm just here to help." In his arms he carried additional supplies, a larger blanket, a flask of warm water, and a pouch of high-calorie food pellets he had originally stocked for emergencies. He placed the items on the floor a few feet from the bear, then backed away slowly. The mother bear sniffed the air, her nostrils flaring as she detected the scent of the food. With a labored effort, she nudged one of the cubs, encouraging it to investigate. The cub's small nose poked out from under the blanket, followed by its hesitant steps toward the food. Ethan held his breath as he watched the cub nibble at the pellets. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Ethan stayed in the storage room for as long as he dared, monitoring the bears and making small adjustments to their environment. He adjusted the position of the portable heater, aiming it closer to the family. He draped the larger blanket over a corner of the room, creating an insulated space for the mother and her cubs to rest. Each movement was slow and careful, mindful of the fragile trust between him and the mother bear. As the hours passed, Ethan noticed small but promising signs of improvement. The mother bear began shifting her position more frequently, ensuring her cubs were covered and warm. The cubs, though still weak, showed increasing curiosity, their small paws batting at the edges of the blanket. Ethan couldn't help but smile at their tentative playfulness, a sign that life was returning to their tiny bodies. By midday, the storm outside showed no signs of abating. The wind howled through the trees, and snow piled against the walls of the cabin and storage room. Ethan knew they were in for another long night, but he felt a glimmer of hope. The bears had made it this far, and he was determined to see them through. Ethan returned to his cabin to prepare more supplies. As he boiled water for another flask, he glanced out the window, his thoughts heavy. He couldn't shake the weight of what he was doing, breaking every wilderness safety rule he had ever followed. Letting the bears into his storage room was risky enough, but actively caring for them blurred the line between survival and interference. Still, as he watched the snow swirl around the storage room, Ethan knew he couldn't have done anything differently. The mother bear's gaze from the night before stayed with him, a silent plea that transcended the usual boundaries between humans and wildlife. As the evening approached, Ethan made his final rounds for the day. He replenished the food and water in the storage room, always careful to give the bears space. The mother bear watched him with cautious eyes, but her body language remained calm. It was as if she understood that Ethan's actions were keeping her and her cubs alive. When Ethan returned to his cabin, he settled by the window, watching the bears through the frosted glass. The mother bear had curled around her cubs once more, their small bodies nestled against her warmth. The portable heater cast a faint glow over the scene, a beacon of life in the midst of the relentless storm. The storm showed no mercy as it raged into its second night. Snow battered the walls of Ethan Carter's cabin. As the hours passed, Ethan remained vigilant, observing the bears through the window from his cabin. The cubs began to show faint signs of playfulness, batting at the edges of the blanket or clumsily nibbling at the food. It was a hopeful sight, but their movements were still sluggish, their energy far from restored. The mother bear, however, continued to deteriorate. Her breathing grew labored, and she shifted positions less frequently. Ethan's concern deepened as he watched her fight to keep herself awake and alert for her cubs. Her strength was fading, and Ethan knew that if she couldn't recover soon, the cubs would be left vulnerable once again. Ethan couldn't shake the unease building inside him. The mother bear's resilience was remarkable, but her injuries and the relentless cold were taking their toll. The food and warmth he had provided had helped, but it wasn't enough to fully restore her. She needed more rest, more time, and perhaps more help than he alone could provide. For the first time, Ethan considered contacting the nearest ranger station for assistance. His satellite phone rested on his desk, fully charged, but the thought of calling for help was fraught with complications. The nearest station was hours away, and the storm made travel nearly impossible. Even if they could come, the process of tranquilizing and relocating the bears would be traumatic and dangerous. But as he watched the mother bear struggle to lift her head once more, Ethan realized that doing nothing wasn't an option. He reached for his phone, his fingers trembling slightly as he dialed the number. The line crackled as the call connected. "Ranger Station, this is Officer Ward," a steady voice answered. "This is Ethan Carter," he began, his voice low but urgent. "I've got a situation here. 3 bears, a mother, and 2 cubs sheltering in my storage room. They're alive, but the mother's in bad shape. I've done what I can, but I don't know how much longer they'll make it." There was a pause on the other end, followed by a sigh. "That's a tough one," Officer Ward replied. "We're snowed in here, and the storm's making it impossible to send a team. Can you hold them until it clears?" "I'll try," Ethan said, glancing toward the storage room. "But she's not doing well. If there's anything you can suggest, anything, I'll do it." Ward gave him a list of tips to keep the bears comfortable and monitor their recovery. "If they make it through the storm," Ward added, "we'll get a team out there as soon as we can." The morning after the storm broke, The world outside Ethan Carter's cabin looked like an untouched masterpiece. The sun gleamed over the snow-covered wilderness, making it glisten like a sea of diamonds. The brutal storm had passed, but its scars remained in the towering drifts of snow and the bowed branches of the surrounding trees. Ethan, bundled in his heavy winter coat, stepped outside, the fresh air crisp and biting against his face. Today, he would check on the bears to see how they had fared after their ordeal. Ethan approached the storage room door with cautious optimism, carrying a small bucket of warm water and some additional food. He had spent much of the storm watching from his cabin window, but he hadn't dared disturb the bears unless absolutely necessary. Now, the softened howls of the wind made the morning feel almost tranquil, a sharp contrast to the chaos of the past 2 days. As he cracked open the door, a wave of warm air met his face, along with the faint sound of movement inside. Peering in, Ethan saw the mother bear lying protectively in a corner, her cubs nestled against her. Both cubs were awake now, their small bodies no longer limp, but showing signs of curiosity and playfulness. One pawed at the edge of a blanket, while the other nudged its sibling with a wobbly nudge. The mother bear lifted her head at Ethan's arrival. Her golden brown eyes met his, steady and calm, though still tinged with exhaustion. It was a look that spoke of cautious acceptance. Ethan held his breath, then slowly placed the water and food near the doorway. He backed away as she sniffed the air, then nudged her cubs toward the provisions. Over the course of the day, Ethan observed the bears from a safe distance, making frequent trips to replenish their supplies. The cubs grew more animated, their small movements becoming bolder. One even clumsily attempted to climb onto its mother's back before tumbling onto the blankets. Their resilience amazed Ethan, a testament to how quickly life could fight back even in the harshest conditions. The mother bear remained vigilant but calm. Each time Ethan came near, she watched him intently, but there was no hostility in her posture. She seemed to understand that he wasn't a threat, only a strange ally in an unfamiliar situation. Ethan couldn't help but marvel at the intelligence behind her gaze. "She's figuring it out," he thought aloud, watching as she carefully broke a chunk of food into smaller pieces for the cubs. "She knows I'm trying to help." That evening, Ethan sat by his window, sipping a steaming mug of tea as he observed the bears through the frosted glass. The cubs were now lively, exploring their temporary shelter with small, tentative steps. Their playfulness seemed to lift the mood of the mother bear, who had begun to groom them with gentle nudges and licks. Despite their progress, Ethan knew they couldn't stay in the storage room much longer. The cubs needed space to grow, and the mother bear needed to return to her natural habitat to fully recover. Prolonging their stay near humans could create complications down the line, both for the bears and for Ethan's safety. Still, the thought of letting them go filled him with a strange sadness. Over the past few days, he had invested so much in their survival, and the bond he felt with them was undeniable. But Ethan knew that true compassion sometimes meant letting go. Before going to bed, Ethan checked the weather report on his satellite radio. The forecast predicted clear skies and rising temperatures, a perfect window for the bears to venture back into the wild. He decided that tomorrow would be the day to open the storage room's outer door and let them leave on their terms. As he prepared for bed, Ethan thought about everything the bears had endured. They had fought through the storm, survived against impossible odds, and were now on the brink of reclaiming their place in the wilderness. Their resilience inspired him, reminding him of the strength that lay within all living beings. Before turning in, Ethan whispered quietly to himself, "Tomorrow, they'll have their freedom again." And as the snow glistened under the pale moonlight, Ethan's heart was filled with a profound sense of hope for the mother bear and her 2 courageous cubs. The morning dawned clear and bright, the sun casting a golden glow across the untouched snow. He knew it was time to let the bears return to the wilderness. Ethan bundled up in his thick winter coat and boots, carrying a few last provisions for the mother bear and her cubs. His footsteps crunched in the snow as he made his way to the storage room. Inside, the bears were stirring, the cubs rolling over each other in playful tumbles. The mother bear stood protectively nearby, her eyes steady and watchful as Ethan approached the door. "Morning, girl," he murmured softly, setting the supplies down just inside the threshold. The mother bear tilted her head slightly, acknowledging his presence. Her powerful frame now exuded strength and grace. a stark contrast to the exhausted creature he had first seen huddled in the storm. Ethan took a deep breath and slowly unlatched the outer door of the storage room. A blast of cold air swept in, carrying with it the scent of freedom. Sunlight poured into the room, and the cubs paused their playful antics, their noses twitching at the unfamiliar smell of the open wilderness. The mother bear rose to her full height, towering over her cubs, and took a cautious step toward the open door. Her muscles tensed as she sniffed the air, her sharp instincts assessing the safety of their surroundings. She turned her head slightly, glancing back at Ethan. In that moment, their eyes met one final time. There was no aggression in her gaze, only a calm, knowing trust. Ethan nodded, his voice quiet but steady. "It's time. You're ready." The mother bear nudged her cubs gently, urging them toward the doorway. The cubs hesitated at first, their small bodies unsure of the vast world beyond the warm, safe enclosure. But with their mother's encouragement, they took tentative steps forward, their tiny paws leaving delicate prints in the snow. The mother bear followed her cubs out of the storage room, her massive form silhouetted against the bright landscape. She paused at the threshold, her head held high as she surveyed the endless expanse of snow-covered wilderness. For a moment, she seemed to inhale the freedom that awaited them, her breath visible in the crisp morning air. Ethan watched in silence, his chest tight with a mix of emotions. The bears had survived an ordeal that should have taken their lives. They were alive because he had taken a risk, broken the rules, and trusted his instincts. And now, they were leaving to reclaim the life that was rightfully theirs. The mother bear began to move, leading her cubs away from the cabin. The little ones bounded through the snow, their renewed energy a testament to their recovery. They frolicked and tumbled as they followed their mother, their playful antics bringing a faint smile to Ethan's face. Just before disappearing into the forest, the mother bear stopped. She turned her head, looking back at Ethan one last time. Her dark eyes locked onto his, and in that brief moment, it felt as though she was thanking him, not with words, but with a silent connection that spoke volumes. Ethan raised a hand in a small wave, his throat tight with unspoken emotions. "Take care of them," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the soft rustle of the trees. The mother bear lingered for a moment longer, then turned and followed her cubs into the shadows of the forest. Their forms grew smaller until they were just dark shapes against the endless white. And then they were gone. Ethan stood there for a long time, the cold biting at his face, though he hardly noticed. The silence around him felt different now, not empty, but full of meaning. He thought about everything that had brought him to this moment, the storm, the decision to open his door, the trust that had grown between him and the bears. Back inside his cabin, Ethan set down his coffee cup and gazed out the window. The snow sparkled under the sun, as if the wilderness itself was celebrating the bears' survival. He felt a profound sense of peace, knowing he had done the right thing, even if it had gone against every rule of wilderness safety he had ever learned. The weeks that followed the storm were marked by quiet reflection for Ethan Carter. Life in the Alaskan wilderness returned to its usual rhythm, days spent gathering firewood, tending to his cabin, and listening to the occasional hum of his weather radio. The memory of the mother bear and her cubs stayed with him, vivid and powerful, a reminder of the fragile yet resilient bond between humans and the natural world. One crisp morning, Ethan stood on his porch, nursing a steaming cup of coffee as the sun rose over the snow-covered landscape. The frost-covered trees sparkled like diamonds in the soft light. It was the kind of serene beauty that had drawn him to this remote corner of Alaska. As he sipped his coffee, a faint rustling caught his attention. He lowered his cup and squinted toward the edge of the forest. At first he thought the movement was caused by the wind stirring the branches, but as he focused, his breath caught in his throat. There, standing in the clearing, were three familiar figures, a mother bear and her two cubs. Ethan's heart raced as he stepped closer to the edge of his porch. The bears stood at a respectful distance, their forms framed by the towering pines. The mother bear's powerful silhouette was unmistakable, and her scars, thin patches of fur where wounds had healed, confirmed her identity. The cubs, now noticeably larger and stronger, frolicked in the snow, their playful energy a stark contrast to the fragile beings he had once rescued. The mother bear lifted her head, her dark eyes meeting Ethan's. He felt a familiar calm settle over him, the same quiet understanding that had passed between them during their time in the storage room. It was as if she was acknowledging him, offering a silent gratitude for the life she and her cubs now enjoyed. Ethan didn't move, not wanting to startle them. The mother bear made no attempt to approach further but remained rooted to the spot, her gaze steady. The cubs continued to wrestle and tumble in the snow, blissfully unaware of the moment of connection between their mother and the man who had saved them. After what felt like an eternity, the mother bear gave a low, gentle grunt, and the cubs stopped their play. She turned toward the forest, leading them back into the shadows. One cub paused, looking back at Ethan with wide, curious eyes before bounding after its mother. Ethan watched until their dark forms disappeared into the trees, leaving only faint tracks in the snow as evidence of their presence. As the morning light grew brighter, Ethan stood motionless on his porch, his coffee now cold in his hand. He felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not just for the bears' survival, but for the opportunity to witness their return. Their visit was a rare gift, a confirmation that the bond they had formed during the storm had not been forgotten. Ethan knew he might never see them again. The wilderness was vast, and the bears would continue their lives far from his small cabin. But their brief reunion was enough. It was a reminder of the profound connections that could form between humans and animals, even in the harshest conditions. That day, as Ethan chopped wood and went about his chores, he found himself reflecting on his experience. He had always respected the wilderness and its creatures, but his encounter with the bears had deepened that respect. It had taught him that survival wasn't just about strength or resilience, it was about compassion and courage. The mother bear and her cubs had become a part of his story, just as he had become a part of theirs. Though their lives had diverged, they would forever be connected by the extraordinary events of that stormy night. As the sun set over the Alaskan wilderness, Ethan stood once more on his porch, looking out toward the forest. "Good luck out there," he murmured softly, as if the bears could still hear him. "Stay safe." With a final glance at the tree line, Ethan turned and stepped back into his cabin, carrying the warmth of their shared bond in his heart. The days following the bears' return passed quietly for Ethan Carter, but something inside him had shifted. The encounter with the mother bear and her cubs had left an indelible mark on his spirit, a reminder of the fragile balance between survival and compassion in the unforgiving wilderness. As he went about his routine, chopping firewood, maintaining his cabin, and listening to the distant call of wolves, he found himself reflecting on the lessons nature had taught him. Ethan often glanced toward the forest, half expecting to see the mother bear and her cubs again. Though he knew their visit was likely a one-time occurrence, the memory of their silhouettes against the snow-filled clearing stayed vivid in his mind. He thought of the mother bear's unwavering determination, the cubs' playful innocence, and the quiet trust that had passed between him and the wild creatures he once feared. In those moments, Ethan felt something profound, a shared bond with nature that went beyond mere survival. It was a reminder that every choice he made, every act of kindness, had the power to ripple outward, touching lives in ways he could never fully understand. Living in the Alaskan wilderness had always been a test of endurance, but this experience had taught Ethan that survival wasn't just about braving the elements or honing his skills. It was about empathy, about recognizing that the world was full of beings, human and animal alike, navigating their own struggles. The mother bear had faced the storm not for herself, but for her cubs, driven by an instinct to protect and nurture them at all costs. Ethan realized that this kind of strength, the strength born from love and responsibility, was something he could carry into his own life. One morning, Ethan retrieved his old camera, a tool he hadn't used in years. For much of his life, he had been a wildlife photographer, capturing the majesty of nature through a lens. But after moving to Alaska, he had put the camera aside, choosing to live in the moment rather than document it. Now, inspired by his experience with the bears, he felt drawn to pick it up again, not to intrude on the lives of wild creatures, but to honor them. He began taking photos of the landscape around him, the snow-draped trees, the glistening rivers, and the open skies that stretched endlessly above. Each image felt like a tribute to the wilderness he had come to love and respect, a way to share its beauty with the world without disrupting its harmony. As winter turned to spring, Ethan found himself standing on his porch one evening, watching the sun set over the horizon. The snow was beginning to melt, revealing patches of green beneath the white blanket. Birds called from the treetops, their songs carrying a sense of renewal. In that moment, Ethan thought of the mother bear and her cubs, now somewhere deep in the forest, living their lives as they were meant to. He felt a quiet pride in knowing that, in a small but significant way, he had been part of their story. The wilderness had tested him, but it had also taught him a powerful truth. Survival wasn't just about enduring, it was about giving, about finding the courage to reach out even when the odds seemed insurmountable. It was about remembering that humanity was part of a larger web of life, one that thrived on compassion and connection. Ethan's encounter with the bears became a guiding force in his life. He committed to sharing his story, not as a tale of heroism, but as a reminder of the responsibility we all share in protecting the world around us. Whether through his photographs or his words, Ethan hoped to inspire others to view nature not as something separate from themselves, but as an extension of their own lives. And as he stood there watching the sun dip below the horizon, Ethan smiled. The wilderness had tested him, shaped him, and ultimately, taught him to be more human. Ethan's journey shows us that acts of courage and compassion have the power to transform not just lives, but hearts. His story reminds us that every choice we make can create ripples of kindness in the world around us. If this tale of resilience and connection resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories about the bond between humanity and nature. Together, let's celebrate and protect the extraordinary life that surrounds us.